The weight of what he had seen gnawed at him. The king, locked in a forbidden embrace with a courtier, their betrayal whispered in the shadows of the palace. The guard knew his silence was an act of loyalty to the king, but every glance at the queen's dignified smile twisted his stomach with guilt. Should the guard keep his loyalty to the king, or should he tell the truth to the queen? Comment what you would do in his situation. Like and subscribe to support the channel, and stay tuned for the full story of betrayal, loyalty, and the clash of a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Ewan had served as a royal guard for 8 years, his life built on discipline, loyalty, and the unyielding code of honor that came with the position. The towering walls of the palace had long become his second home, and though his duties were demanding, they filled him with purpose. He was proud to serve King Alden, a man revered by the kingdom for his wisdom and charisma, and Queen Seraphina, who carried herself with grace and strength, beloved by the people. To Ewan, they were the embodiment of the monarchy's ideals, unshakable, noble, and just. But as he would soon learn, the truth behind the gilded facade was far more fragile. It began on a quiet evening when Ewan was stationed outside the king's private chambers. The halls were still, lit only by the flickering glow of torches mounted on the stone walls. The sound of his boots against the floor was the only thing to accompany the silence as he paced, his watch uneventful as it had been so many nights before. But that night, something felt different. The air carried a tension he couldn't quite place, a sense of unease that prickled at the edges of his mind. The doors to the king's chamber were slightly ajar, a break from the protocol, as they were always supposed to be sealed when the king was inside. Curiosity tugged at Ewan's sense of duty. At first, he resisted the urge to look, telling himself it was not his place to intrude. But then he heard the low murmur of voices, a woman's voice mingled with the king's deep baritone, the words indistinct but unmistakably intimate. Ewan's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was hearing. Against his better judgment, he leaned closer, peering through the crack in the door. Inside, King Alden stood by the hearth, his arm wrapped around a young woman dressed in the silks of a courtier. Her laughter was soft, but the way she gazed at the king was anything but innocent. Ewan's heart pounded as he watched the king lower his head to hers, their lips meeting in a kiss that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. He stepped back, his mind racing. The woman wasn't the queen. There was no mistaking that. The queen's golden hair and regal bearing were a stark contrast to the dark-haired courtier who now stood with her hands pressed against the king's chest. Ewan felt a pang of anger and betrayal twist in his gut. This was the man he had sworn to protect, the ruler he had admired for years. How could King Alden, who had spoken so often of duty and honor, betray his queen in such a way? For the rest of his shift, Ewan couldn't focus. The image of the king with his lover replayed in his mind, constant reminder of what he had seen. When his replacement arrived, Ewan retreated to the barracks, but sleep eluded him. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the secret pressing down on him. Should he tell someone? Should he confront the king? Or should he remain silent and pretend he had seen nothing? The next day, Ewan tried to go about his duties as usual, but the sight of the queen at breakfast in the great hall made his chest tighten with guilt. She sat beside the king, her expression serene as she listened to him speak with the court advisors. If she suspected anything, she gave no sign of it. Ewan found himself studying her, searching for cracks in her composure, but there were none. She looked every bit the dignified monarch, her faith in her husband seemingly unshaken. It made Ewan's burden feel heavier. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the secret only grew. Ewan noticed the king's absences more keenly now, the excuses he gave for missing certain dinners or council meetings. There were whispers among the staff, hushed mentions of the king's late-night visits to the eastern wing of the palace, but no one dared say more. Ewan began to wonder how many people knew or suspected the truth. Were they all complicit in keeping the queen in the dark? One evening, as Ewan stood watch near the queen's private chambers, she called him inside. It was an unusual request, as she rarely spoke directly to the guards, but he obeyed without hesitation. The queen was seated by the window, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her blue eyes piercing in their intensity. "Ewan," she said softly, "you've served this family for many years. I trust you." The words sent a jolt through him. Did she know? Had she somehow discovered the king's infidelity? Ewan kept his expression neutral, his training taking over. "It is my honor to serve your majesty," he replied. The queen studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "I have sensed a change in the atmosphere lately," she said. People are whispering, and my husband has been distant. If there is something I should know, I trust you to tell me." Ewan's throat went dry. She was giving him an opening, a chance to reveal the truth. But could he? If he spoke, he would be betraying the king, breaking his oath as a guard. Yet if he stayed silent, he would be betraying the queen, a woman who had done nothing to deserve such deception. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Majesty." The queen's gaze lingered on him, as though she could see the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. Finally, she nodded, though her expression was tinged with disappointment. "Very well," she said. "Thank you, Ewan. You may go." Ewan bowed and left the room, his chest tight with shame. He had made his choice, but it felt like a betrayal nonetheless. As he returned to his post, he resolved to keep the secret, to remain loyal to the king. But deep down, he knew the truth had a way of coming to light, and when it did, the consequences would be far-reaching. Ewan spent the following days in a haze of guilt and unease. His every interaction with the royal family felt like walking a tightrope. Whenever he crossed paths with the king, he forced himself to stand stoic and respectful, even as anger simmered beneath his calm facade. The man who had once been his greatest inspiration now felt like a stranger, a hypocrite whose private actions undermined the very ideals he preached to his people. The queen's quiet dignity, on the other hand, weighed heavily on Ewan's conscience. She carried herself with such grace, never once betraying any hint of suspicion or pain. But there were moments when he thought he caught a shadow in her expression, a fleeting look of weariness when she thought no one was watching. It haunted him, making him question whether she already knew and had simply chosen to endure in silence for the sake of the crown. One night, while Ewan patrolled the palace grounds, he heard whispers drifting from the direction of the eastern wing. The halls were dimly lit, the shadows deepening the sense of secrecy that seemed to permeate the palace lately. He followed the sound, his steps careful and silent, until he reached a small door leading to one of the private gardens. Peering through the gap, he saw the king again, his arm wrapped around the same dark-haired woman Ewan had seen weeks before. They spoke in low tones, their heads close together, and though Ewan couldn't make out the words, the intimacy between them was unmistakable. Ewan clenched his fists, torn between the instinct to confront the king and the fear of overstepping his bounds. Instead, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. He told himself it wasn't his place to interfere, but the hollow feeling in his chest told him otherwise. Each time he witnessed the king's betrayal, it felt like another crack in the foundation of his loyalty, another test of his resolve to remain silent. The breaking point came a few days later, during a grand feast in the Great Hall. The nobility had gathered to celebrate the anniversary of the king and queen's coronation, a night meant to honor their unity and strength as rulers. The hall was alive with music and laughter, the air filled with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. Ewan stood at his usual post near the dais, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. But his attention kept drifting to the royal table, where the king sat beside the queen, his charm on full display as he toasted the guests and regaled them with stories. Ewan watched as the queen smiled politely, though her eyes rarely met the king's. Her composure was flawless, but there was an unmistakable distance between them, a rift that no amount of pageantry could disguise. Then, as the evening wore on, Ewan noticed the king glancing across the room, his gaze lingering on a particular guest. The dark-haired woman was there, seated among the courtiers, her laughter ringing out like a bell. The king's eyes lit with an unmistakable spark, and Ewan felt his stomach twist. The queen must have noticed as well, for her smile faltered, her gaze following the king's. Though she quickly masked her reaction, the moment did not escape Ewan's notice. The queen's knuckles whitened as she gripped the stem of her goblet, her expression briefly betraying a mixture of hurt and anger before she regained her composure. She turned back to the conversation at hand, her face the perfect mask of calm, but the damage had been done. That night, Ewan was summoned to her chambers. When he entered, he found her standing by the hearth, her back to him. The firelight cast a warm glow over her figure, but there was a tension in her posture that set Ewan on edge. She turned when she heard him approach, her expression unreadable. "Ewan," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a faint edge of steel, "I need you to be honest with me." Ewan's heart pounded in his chest. "Your Majesty, do not lie to me," she interrupted, her tone sharper now. "I know something is wrong. I see it in the way my husband looks at her. I see it in the way the staff avoids my gaze. And I see it in you, Ewan. You have always been loyal to this family, but lately you seem burdened by something. If you know the truth, I ask you to tell me now." Ewan froze, his mind racing. The queen's piercing gaze bore into him, and for a moment he felt like a child caught in a lie. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, the words sticking in his throat. He wanted to deny everything, to claim ignorance and spare himself the consequences of betrayal. But the look in her eyes, so full of quiet pain and desperate hope, broke something inside him. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I have seen things, Your Majesty. Things that I wish I hadn't." The queen's expression hardened, but there was no surprise in her eyes. "I see. And these things, do they involve my husband?" Ewan nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes, Your Majesty." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ewan dared a glance at the queen and saw that her hands were trembling. She turned away, her shoulders rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. "Thank you for your honesty," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "You may go." Ewan hesitated, torn between relief and regret. He wanted to say more, to offer some kind of comfort, but he knew it was not his place. Bowing deeply, he left the room, the weight of his confession pressing down on him like a stone. He had done what he thought was right, but the consequences of his choice were far from over. As the days passed, Ewan noticed subtle changes in the palace. The queen became more reserved, her interactions with the king colder and more formal. The king, oblivious to her growing distance, continued his dalliances with the dark-haired courtier, unaware that his secret was no longer safe. And Ewan, caught in the middle, felt the tension building like a storm on the horizon, knowing it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Ewan's confession to the queen had unleashed a series of events he could not control. Though her response had been measured in the moment, the days that followed were anything but calm. Queen Seraphina moved with an air of precision and quiet purpose, her actions deliberate yet restrained. She had not confronted the king directly, at least not in any way that spilled into public view, but a palpable shift had taken place in the atmosphere of the palace. Even the courtiers, who thrived on intrigue, grew more cautious, their whispers quieter, their movements more subdued. Something was brewing beneath the surface. Ewan's own position became increasingly precarious. Though he had done his duty as best as he could reconcile it, he found no peace in his decision. The burden of the truth still weighed heavily on him, and he felt trapped in the tension between the king and queen, their unspoken conflict hanging like a blade above his head. It was during one of his evening patrols that the first crack in the facade became visible. The queen summoned him again, this time to a secluded sitting room in the western wing of the palace. When he arrived, she was not alone. A single lady-in-waiting stood by her side, her head bowed and her hands clasped nervously. The queen dismissed the servant with a wave, waiting for the door to close behind her before addressing Ewan. "You've served this family faithfully for years, Ewan," she began, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made him stand at attention. "And because of that, I will ask you to serve me in one more way. It is not an order, but a request, and I hope you will understand the delicacy of what I'm about to say." Ewan's pulse quickened. "Your Majesty, I will do whatever is required of me." The queen tilted her head, her piercing blue eyes studying him. "I hope you mean that, because what I ask may cost you more than you are prepared to give." She motioned for him to come closer, and he obeyed. "The king," she said softly, almost too softly to be heard, "thinks he is untouchable. He thinks his actions are invisible or excusable because no one dares to confront him. But I refuse to let him tarnish the crown with his indiscretions." Ewan swallowed hard. He had never heard the queen speak with such steel in her voice. "What would you have me do, Your Majesty?" "I need proof," she said simply. "Undeniable evidence of his betrayal. The whispers are not enough, nor are the glances and murmurs at court. If I am to protect myself and this kingdom, I need something that cannot be denied or explained away. You are one of the few people with access to his private movements. I need you to watch him, to document his meetings, his late-night visits, and to tell me everything." Ewan felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. This was more than he had anticipated, more than he had ever been trained to handle. The idea of actively spying on the king, to gather evidence against the very man he had sworn to protect, felt like crossing an irreversible line. But when he looked into the queen's eyes, he saw no malice, only desperation and a resolve born of survival. "It will be dangerous," the queen continued. If he finds out, I cannot protect you. But if you do this for me, Ewan, I will ensure that your loyalty is never forgotten. Not by me, not by my son. The mention of the young prince, barely 12 years old, struck a nerve. Ewan had always felt a particular protectiveness toward the boy, who bore none of the flaws or vices of his father. In that moment, he made his decision. I will do as you ask, your majesty, he said, bowing low. I will not fail you. The nights that followed tested Ewan in ways he had never imagined. He began tracking the king's movements, keeping to the shadows, and using his intimate knowledge of the palace to avoid detection. The task required every ounce of his training and ingenuity, for the king's habits were unpredictable, and his trysts often took place in secluded corners of the palace that were difficult to access without drawing attention. It was on the third night of his covert surveillance that Ewan struck gold. The king had slipped away from a council meeting under the pretense of attending to urgent correspondence. Ewan followed him from a distance, his footsteps silent, as he trailed the king through the labyrinthine corridors of the eastern wing. The king entered a private study, a room rarely used except for clandestine meetings. Through a crack in the door, Ewan saw him embrace the dark-haired courtier, their movements intimate and unguarded. Ewan withdrew, his heart pounding. He couldn't linger without risking discovery, but what he had seen was enough. He returned to his quarters, where he jotted down the details of the encounter in a small, leather-bound journal, the queen's request for documentation clear in his mind. Each word felt like a betrayal, but he forced himself to continue, knowing that this was what he had agreed to. The next night, he followed the king again, this time to a secluded pavilion in the royal gardens. Once more, the courtier was waiting, her laughter drifting through the air like a song. Ewan hid among the hedges, his vantage point perfect for observing the pair as they spoke in hushed tones and exchanged fleeting kisses. It was a surreal experience, watching the man he had once admired act with such recklessness. For the first time, Ewan began to question whether the king deserved the loyalty of those who served him. Over the course of a week, Ewan amassed enough evidence to fill several pages of his journal. When he finally presented it to the queen, her expression was unreadable as she flipped through the entries. She remained silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire in the hearth. You have done well, she said at last, closing the journal and setting it aside. Better than I could have hoped. What will you do now, your majesty? Ewan asked cautiously. The queen's gaze hardened. That is for me to decide. But know this, Ewan, you have given me the power to act. And when the time comes, I will not hesitate. Ewan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he had set something in motion that could not be undone. As he left the queen's chambers that night, a sense of foreboding settled over him. The queen had the proof she needed, but what she intended to do with it remained a mystery, and Ewan could only pray that his loyalty would not come at too great a cost. The storm that had been brewing in the palace broke a week later, though not in the way Ewan had anticipated. The queen, armed with the evidence Ewan had provided, began her campaign with subtle precision. She didn't confront the king outright, at least not publicly. Instead, she leveraged her newfound knowledge to quietly shift the balance of power in her favor. Ewan noticed the changes immediately. The queen became more assertive during court sessions, her voice sharper, her commands more direct. She began meeting privately with key advisors, fostering alliances with those who had grown disillusioned with the king's leadership. The tension between her and King Alden became palpable, though neither of them addressed it openly. It was as though they were locked in a silent battle, each maneuvering carefully to avoid drawing blood too soon. For Ewan, the days were fraught with anxiety. He knew that his role in the Queen's plan made him a target should the king ever discover the truth. Every time he stood in the king's presence, he felt the weight of his secret pressing down on him. Yet he remained steadfast, telling himself that he was doing what was best for the kingdom. The breaking point came during a grand banquet held to honor a visiting delegation from a neighboring kingdom. The event was meant to showcase the unity and strength of Alden's reign, a chance to impress the foreign envoys with the splendor of the court. But beneath the glittering surface, the cracks in the royal family's facade were impossible to ignore. The queen arrived late, a calculated move that immediately drew attention. Dressed in a gown of deep emerald, she commanded the room with her presence, her every step radiating confidence. She took her seat beside the king without so much as a glance in his direction, her expression cool and composed. The king, for his part, seemed determined to play the role of the charming monarch, engaging the envoys with tales of his victories and plans for future alliances. But as the evening wore on, the queen's silence grew more pointed. When the king raised his goblet to toast their union, her smile was brittle, her eyes sharp as she met his gaze. To unity, she said, her voice carrying just enough of an edge to make those closest to the dais exchange uneasy glances. The tension reached its peak when the dark-haired courtier appeared among the assembled guests. She had been invited as part of the delegation, a fact that Ewan suspected was no coincidence. The queen's eyes flicked toward the woman, her expression unreadable, but Ewan could see the way her hand tightened around the stem of her goblet. The king, oblivious or simply careless, allowed his gaze to linger on the courtier for a moment too long. It was enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. The queen rose from her seat, the suddenness of the movement drawing all eyes to her. "If you will excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm, "I find myself in need of some air." Without waiting for a response, she swept from the hall, her attendants hurrying to follow. The king hesitated, clearly caught off guard, but he quickly masked his discomfort with a laugh. "It seems even queens can be overwhelmed by the splendor of our court," he said, earning a few scattered chuckles from the guests. But the damage had been done. The queen's departure left a shadow over the evening that no amount of charm could dispel. Ewan found her in the royal gardens later that night. She was alone, seated on a stone bench beneath a towering oak tree, the faint glow of the moon casting her in silvery light. She looked up as he approached, her expression softening slightly when she recognized him. "I thought you might come," she said, her voice low and weary. "Your Majesty," Ewan began, his tone hesitant. "I wanted to ensure you were safe." The queen let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Safe," she repeated. "What a curious word. Am I safe, Ewan? Safe from the whispers, from the lies, from betrayal that surrounds me?" Ewan said nothing, unsure how to respond. After a moment, the queen sighed and rose to her feet, her gaze drifting toward the palace. "I thought I could endure it," she said quietly. "For the sake of my son, for the sake of the crown. But every time I see him, every time I see her, it becomes harder to pretend. Harder to convince myself that this charade is worth the cost." Ewan hesitated, then spoke the words that had been weighing on him since the night he confessed to her. "Your Majesty, if I may, you do not have to face this alone. There are those who would stand with you, who would protect you." The queen turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "And you are one of them?" she asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Always." For a moment, the queen looked as though she might say something more, but then the sound of approaching footsteps broke the stillness. One of her ladies in waiting appeared, her expression anxious as she curtsied. "Your Majesty," the woman said, "the king is looking for you. He insists on your presence in the council chamber." The queen's expression hardened, the moment of vulnerability vanishing as she straightened her shoulders. "Very well," she said, her voice once again regal and composed. She glanced at Ewan, her gaze lingering for a moment. "Thank you, Ewan. You may return to your post." Ewan bowed as she swept past him, the lady in waiting trailing behind. As he watched her disappear into the shadows of the palace, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was about to break, and when it did, there would be no going back. The next morning, the palace awoke to chaos. A rumor spread like wildfire through the halls. The queen had confronted the king in the dead of night, her accusation sharp and unrelenting. No one knew exactly what had transpired behind the closed doors of the council chamber, but the tension that had simmered for weeks had finally erupted into open conflict. The court buzzed with speculation, servants and guards alike trading whispered theories about what would happen next. Ewan, for his part, felt a mix of relief and dread. The queen had taken the first step in challenging the king's behavior, but the cost of her defiance remained uncertain. As he prepared for his duties that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that his role in this unfolding drama was far from over. The day after the confrontation, the atmosphere of the palace had changed irrevocably. It was no longer a place of whispers and shadows, but of palpable tension that felt ready to snap at any moment. Guards exchanged nervous glances during their shifts, courtiers moved cautiously through the halls, and servants avoided eye contact altogether. The power struggle between the king and queen was no longer a quiet, unspoken thing. It had become a battle being fought in plain sight. Ewan stood at his post near the royal council chamber, his mind racing with unease. Inside, the king was meeting with his most trusted advisors, but the usual air of formality was absent. Raised voices carried through the thick wooden doors, the tone unmistakably heated. Though Ewan couldn't make out every word, the occasional phrases cut through clearly. Ungrateful and insubordinate. Damage to the crown's reputation. Irreparable if this continues. The door suddenly opened, and one of the king's advisors stormed out, his face flushed with anger. Ewan straightened, his training keeping him still as the man marched past without so much as a glance. Moments later, the queen emerged, her head held high despite the storm clearly raging behind her calm exterior. Her ladies-in-waiting trailed after her, their expressions tight with worry. Ewan risked a glance at her as she passed. Her eyes briefly met his, and in that fleeting moment, he saw the depth of her resolve and the weight of her burden. She didn't pause or speak to him, but the look was enough to convey that the battle was far from over. The king followed not long after, his expression dark and thunderous. He barely acknowledged Ewan as he swept down the corridor, flanked by his remaining advisors. It was clear to anyone paying attention that the rift between the royal couple had grown too wide to ignore. And yet, the full consequences of their conflict had yet to unfold. 2 days later, the queen summoned Ewan again. This time, the meeting was far more secretive, held in a small, unused chamber deep within the western wing of the palace. When he arrived, she was alone, her usual attendants absent. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single candle on the table between them. Ewan, she said as he entered, her voice quieter than usual, but no less commanding. Close the door. He obeyed, his unease growing. The queen gestured for him to sit, an unusual break in protocol that made him hesitate before taking the chair across from her. She looked tired, her regal composure fraying at the edges, but her gaze remained sharp. The time has come to act, she said without preamble. The confrontation the other night was only the beginning. Alden has made it clear that he will not change his ways, nor will he acknowledge the damage he has done to this kingdom and to me. If I continue to do nothing, he will destroy everything we have built. Ewan's pulse quickened. What do you intend to do, Your Majesty? The queen leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. I intend to make it clear to him, and to the court, that his actions have consequences. But to do so, I need your help. Ewan stiffened. Your Majesty, my loyalty to you is absolute, but I must know what you are asking of me. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. The journal you kept for me, the evidence you gathered, it will serve as the foundation of my case against him. But that alone will not be enough. I need witnesses, people who can corroborate what is in those pages. And I need protection. Protection? Ewan echoed, frowning. Do you believe the king would? I believe he is desperate, the queen said bluntly, and desperation makes men dangerous. If he feels cornered, there is no telling what he might do. You are one of the few people I trust to ensure my safety, and the safety of my son. The mention of the prince made Ewan's resolve harden. He had always admired the young boy's kind heart and unyielding sense of justice, traits that reminded him more of the queen than the king. The idea of Alden's recklessness putting the prince in danger filled Ewan with a cold determination. I will protect you, he said firmly. And the prince. Whatever it takes. The queen's expression softened slightly, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. Thank you, Ewan. I know what I ask of you is dangerous, but I would not ask it if I believed there was any other way. The days that followed were tense and filled with quiet preparations. Ewan worked discreetly to identify potential allies among the palace staff and guards, those who had grown disillusioned with the king's behavior or who held deep loyalty to the queen. It was a delicate task, requiring careful judgment and subtlety to avoid arousing suspicion. Meanwhile, the queen began laying the groundwork for her next move. She called private meetings with influential members of the court, presenting them with carefully curated pieces of evidence to sway their loyalties. It was a calculated gamble, one that required equal parts courage and cunning. Slowly but surely, the tide began to shift in her favor. But the king was no fool. Though he remained outwardly composed, it was clear that he sensed the growing threat to his authority. His temper grew shorter, his demands more erratic. He began summoning Ewan to his side more frequently, often under the guise of routine security checks, but Ewan suspected the real reason was to gauge his loyalty. Each time, Ewan maintained a neutral facade, offering no hint of his involvement in the queen's plans. The tipping point came one fateful evening when the king called an emergency council meeting. Ewan was stationed outside the chamber, his nerves taut as he listened to the raised voices within. The meeting dragged on for hours, the tension palpable even from his post. When the doors finally opened, the queen emerged first, her face pale but resolute. She paused briefly as she passed Ewan, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "It begins tonight," she said, her words heavy with meaning. Ewan nodded, his heart pounding. The storm they had been preparing for was finally upon them, and there was no turning back. What would you do in Ewan's place? Would you stay loyal to a king who betrayed everything you stood for, or risk everything to protect the truth and the queen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're hooked by the twists and betrayals in this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. Your support helps us bring you more exciting tales like this one. Don't miss what's coming next.